Bob Herbert's op-ed.tv is made possible in part by the CUNY TV Foundation with the support of Ann Ulnick. Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to op-ed.tv. The COVID-19 pandemic, which has been a scourge across the United States and around the world, has had a tragically disproportionate effect on America's Black communities. And yet some members of the African American and other communities of color have been among those initially reluctant to take the vaccines that have been developed to combat the pandemic. Why is that? And what's being done to reverse that reluctance? I'll talk about that with my guest, Arva Rice, President and CEO of the New York Urban League, and a member of a task force that has been formed here in New York to spread the word about the safety and efficacy of the vaccines and to make sure that they are widely accessible in communities of color. Ms. Rice, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Bob. I'm excited about this conversation.
This is terrific. So let's start by going back a little ways. Much of the reluctance among African Americans to take this vaccine goes back to a very long-standing distrust of the healthcare system in the United States. And that's the healthcare system in general. And what I'm talking about is something that goes back decades. And it may be that some of our younger viewers are not that familiar with the roots of this reluctance, this distrust. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I wanted to talk about and respond to your question, and also let you know that, and the viewers know, that I'm actually pleased that we're at the point of talking about hesitancy, because in the beginning of this virus, it really was about access, and people wanted to jump to hesitancy. But the fact is, even those people who wanted to take the vaccine, could not get access, and it was because they put together a computer solution. You had to go online to be able to get an appointment to go and get the vaccine. And that was something that was just prohibitive to so many of our communities. And so I'm happy that we're now at the point to actually talk about hesitation. And as you mentioned, that hesitation really does come from, decades long of distrust and mistrust of the healthcare system, going back to the Tuskegee experiment, where African-American men were literally preyed upon and given syphilis and did not know it. Where our bodies were considered to be not our own and not important. And there were other experiments that have happened during time. But I think our young people are familiar with the issues having to do with the healthcare system because they've personally experienced it as well. Some of the issues that African Americans have with the healthcare system are historical, but they're also based on an experience that they had last week trying to interact with the healthcare system. And we talk about African American women in our maternal health and our pain not being perceived as truly being painful as other groups. And so I think that the issues that we have with the healthcare system are historical, and they're also ones that we're still battling with every day.
Well, I want to point out, you mentioned the Tuskegee study. It was really an experiment. And I just would like to point out that went on from 1942, I believe it was, until 1972. I mean, so we're talking about 30 years. They had African-American men who either had syphilis or were deliberately infected with syphilis. And then the experiment was to see what happens with somebody who has syphilis untreated for a long period of time. So they withheld any treatment for these men, and they compared them to a control group of people who did not have syphilis. Now, by the mid-40s, it was clear that penicillin was an effective treatment for syphilis. Mm-hmm. And the experiment had only started a few years before that. They did not give these men penicillin. So the 50s and the 60s went by, and we went into the 70s, and these poor individuals who had syphilis were not treated for it. So it's that kind of outrageous, outlandish, frightening, and tragic behavior that is among the roots of this reluctance, along with some of the other points that you were just making. Can we talk a little bit about your task force? What's its official name, and who formed it, and what are some of your goals?
Sure. So I'm a part of the New York State Vaccine Equity and Education Task Force. It was formed in New York State because, as we know, COVID ravaged the communities here in New York State first and foremost. And so Reverend Al Sharpton of the National Action Network, our leader, Mark Morial of the National Urban League, and Senator Nina Turner are all co-chairs of this task force, who work with Jennifer Jones Austin of the Federation of Protestant Welfare Agencies and Hazel Dukes of the NAACP, all coming together really to look at this issue both of vaccine accessibility, looking at issues of hesitancy, and also looking at issues of education, because we thought that those three were really primary factors and indicators. Because, as you mentioned, long history of distrust and mistrust in the healthcare system that's based on some historical horrific incidents that happen within our communities, but also ongoing pain that is not addressed and attributed in the way that it needs to be. And so wanting to be able to provide information for our communities. And so that's why the task force was really created.
The explain to me how the task force works. Do you have volunteers? Are you going into the communities? Are you talking to people, finding out first, if they're reluctant, and if so, why? How are you going about this?
Sure. So it's really a collaboration. And so that's what's really important about it. And so obviously the NAACP, the National Action Network, the New York Urban League has networks of affiliates, not only in New York City, but around the country, that come together to work on equity issues on a regular basis. The Federation of Protestant Welfare Agencies took the lead into developing a toolkit that has become available to anyone, and they can download on their website. And now the National Urban League, working with all of its member affiliates and the National Action Network, has created an all-in campaign. And so what we're working to do is to provide social media messages to our communities. As you mentioned, having direct conversation with folks, doing town halls, whether they're on using social media and working on Zoom, but really working hard to get out the message. And one of the things that Hazel Dukes speaks about is it's important for those people who have gotten vaccinated to talk about it and to say, I got vaccinated, this was my experience, I took Pfizer, I took Moderna, I took the Johnson & Johnson, but this is what happened, this is the reason why I made that decision to go ahead and take the vaccine. And so that's what it's really about, is about working with trusted messengers, whether it's in your church, whether it's a member of your community-based organization, somebody who lives in your project or in your housing development, and just having them be able to talk about their experiences and give valuable information on the vaccine.
So you mentioned the longstanding distrust among some people with the healthcare system itself, but that's not the only reason that some people have been reluctant to take the vaccine. So what are some of the other things you're finding out when folks are in the community are engaged and asked whether they're going to take the vaccine? What are they telling you?
Sure. I'll give you the response, the official response that the Ad Council, who did a number of different focus groups and came out with some of their answers. And then I'll give you the answers from the work of our staff and the conversations that they have been having at the local level. And not surprisingly, a lot of those answers are very familiar. Basically, there's three buckets of people who are having some hesitancy around taking the vaccine. The first group is the folks that are just skeptical. They're skeptical about government because of things like the Tuskegee Airmen, Tuskegee experiment.
Yeah.
And they're also reluctant because of government systems. They're afraid that that the vaccine came to market in what they felt like was a hurried way, and they don't understand all of that. So that just makes them kind of skeptical. There's some folks that are undecided. They're the folks who wouldn't get the first version of a cell phone, but they wait till all the bugs get out of it, and they would get that second version. So if they'd only get the second version of the new iPhone, why should they get the first version of Pfizer? So wait a little bit and see about taking it a couple of months down the road. And then there's the last group of people that are engaged, but they're just still trying to figure it out. Where do they get the test? What's the difference between Pfizer and Moderna? This Johnson & Johnson study, it caused blood clots in some people. How many people is that? And could that affect me? So they're engaged, but they're just still trying to figure it out. And so what we have been working to do is to figure out messages that, first of all, are respectful of wherever people are on the spectrum. It's not about judging people for being undecided. It's not about shaking people and saying, the Tuskegee experiment went over 30 years, but that was many years ago. So why are you caught up in that? It's about recognizing where they are and kind of moving from that point in place in time. When I've had conversations with staff members and staff who are working directly in community, they have very similar responses. The only one thing that they add is that there's some folks that are just plain scared of needles.
There's a lot of people who are just scared
so that's the one addition, right? Yeah, that's the one addition. So they have folks that are concerned about systems. They're undecided. They're trying to wait it out to see how it goes. But then there's just some folks that are scared of needles. So I think that's a concern that we need to take in mind.
Well, one of the triumphs, I think, of the vaccines, the whole system, is that they were developed so fast. Usually vaccines take many years. It takes a long time, many years to develop an effective vaccine. This was done in a hurry because we were in an emergency, and I'm glad that they did. And just for the record, I am fully vaccinated and have been. I was never reluctant. But your point is a good one. There's nothing strange about people saying, hey, this was a hurry up kind of thing. They developed these vaccines a lot faster than they usually develop vaccines. I really would like to see a little more evidence that these things are effective or that these vaccines are safe. So it's not crazy that there has been some skepticism, not just about African Americans, but in many communities about this. But you also brought up another point that I'd like to ask you to follow up on, and that is the people who have sort of had a jaundiced view of those who are reluctant to take the vaccine. And then they point out that the Tuskegee experiment was decades and decades ago, and that there has been a lot of coverage of these vaccines, and they do appear to be safe. But I've heard people say anybody who doesn't want to take this vaccine is stupid. I have no patience with them. They're ignorant, and that sort of thing is just unfair. So my question is, what would you say to people who hold that view of people who are skeptics about the vaccine, or who are reluctant, at least initially, to take the vaccine?
Mm-hmm. I don't think that COVID-19 gives anyone the right to judge anyone, right? So I think that's not an appropriate response. And the fact is, everyone has a right to their opinion. Everyone has a right to come to their decision in their own time. And so that's the reason why the commission that I sit on has education in its title. We just want to make sure that people know about the vaccine. One of the things that I talked about was the importance of trusted messengers. I was already friends with the CEO of Harlem Hospital. Now we are best friends because I'm hooked at the arm, constantly having her come to places, having her doctors come to places and talk and speak African-American woman to African-American woman about, I understand these are your concerns. Let me talk to you about the difference between the Pfizer and the Moderna and the Johnson & Johnson. To hear from people who look like us, who have shared life experiences, I think is really important to be able to ask any question that you have. There is no question that's silly. There is no question that's stupid. We want to make sure we hear all of them in order that people can feel confident ultimately about their decisions.
Another point that I would like to make is that we've been talking, and with good reason, about the reluctance among African Americans and some other communities of color to take this vaccine. First and foremost, I'd like to point out that that does not mean that all African Americans are reluctant to take this vaccine. So they've been lining up in droves to
Mhm.
take the vaccine.
It's true.
But I read in the New York Times just on the day that we're doing this telecast that the strongest resistance to the vaccines is not among people of color, but it's among people who identify as white. They are rural. They're primarily Republican and evangelical Christians.
Mm.
So I think that it's very important to point out the reluctance among African Americans and to try and overcome that reluctance. But I think the more you talk about it, then you can sort of create an incorrect impression, either that most African Americans don't want to get these shots, or that this is the group that more than any other group is reluctant in this country. And neither one of those things are true.
Mhm.
Um, Another point that you touched on was that initially it was very difficult to access the vaccines.
Mhm.
And that was for everybody. I mean, my wife and I had a heck of a time trying to schedule our shots. And of course, in uh, communities that are less affluent, they don't have, as you pointed out, the access to the internet that some other communities have. So it was very difficult for African Americans at first. But now the vaccines are more widely available, but still there are some other reasons um, uh, that make it difficult to get the shot. And the point that I'm trying to get to is that a lot of people in the African American community are not getting the shots, not because they're opposed to them or because they're skeptical or they don't trust the vaccines,
Mhm.
but because they're not quite sure about how to get, how to still not quite sure how to access the shots, or they may be working full time or sometimes more than one job. They have family responsibilities. They have difficulty finding the time to schedule um, um, back shots. Can you talk about what you're doing to try and make it easier for folks like that to get the vaccines?
Absolutely. I wanted to go back to your first comment that you made and just agree wholeheartedly that when we talk about hesitancy, that this isn't just an issue that's within the African American community. Some of the folks that you talked about that are from the rural areas, from the Midwest, evangelical, are on my Facebook page. And so I heard all kinds of comments from them when I, showed my picture saying, I've got my first shot. I'm vaxxed, right? And so I was proud and had my picture. And, a lot of them were saying, why did you do that? And we don't know, and all these other sorts of things. And so it was an opportunity for me personally to have to, rather than saying, anything negative, I have to appreciate where they are and, in
Right.
that moment of education, right? So I do think that this notion and issue of hesitancy, that the messages have to go towards our community, but have to go towards others as well, and trying
Right.
to figure out ways in which to move forward, which also goes to my second question. And I do think that former President Donald Trump, who did have the vaccine, needs to speak up, but that's
And try to keep it secret.
Yes, exactly. So him and Melania need to show their pictures of them taking the vaccine. I think that that's really important. Which goes to my second point, which you were saying about individuals who want to take the vaccine. But I mean, quite frankly, I did very well after I took mine, but I was sleepy. And so I work in an industry where I could send a text to my staff members and say, can we reschedule that meeting that was supposed to be at 1? I can't do it till 4 because I literally need to lay down right now. Like I am
Right.
taking this Pfizer vaccine. And so I think it's important for us to encourage employers that if they want us to return to the economy and get the economy back to its former place, that we really need to provide support for workers. I recently did a panel discussion with Jennifer Jones Austin and Hazel Dukes with the Association for Better New York, which is an association of thousands of businesses here in New York City. And so I said that one of the greatest things that they could do towards pushing us towards herd immunity is to provide support for their workers, giving them extra hours, creating times and dates in that order that if individuals want to take the vaccine that they can, and also to develop partnerships. The Harlem Hospital and others are open to making sure that as many New Yorkers are vaccinated as possible. And then the last thing that I want to say about that is that our work really is beginning right now, because we really are getting to those folks who are reluctant. So we need to be creative. I give a lot of credit to our governor and to our mayor for making the decision to provide vaccines availability at housing projects, to make it available in churches. But the fact is that when you talk to younger Black New Yorkers, they want to receive the vaccine in a healthcare facility, right? So they don't want to receive
Interesting.
they don't want to receive it in a parking lot. They don't want to receive it at a church. And quite frankly, not as many of the younger folks go to church as maybe their
Right.
grandparents, right? So how do we make sure that there's enough vaccine that's available at hospitals, at pharmacies, and maybe even getting them to private clinicians so that people can just go to their doctor and be able to get the vaccine. And I think that might be the next frontier.
When you and I were talking by phone yesterday, you mentioned what you described as the opportunity of this moment. And you talked a little bit about what's possible. So can you tell us what you meant by the opportunity of this moment?
Mhm. The fact is that COVID-19 laid bare the inequities that exist in our healthcare system. There was just no denying it that, African Americans and Latinos got this disease at higher numbers. We live in closer quarters. We were doing more of the essential worker positions. We have underlying comorbidities. All these things came together in a perfect storm for us. And so we can make sure that folks get the vaccine. We can make sure that they have education and access. But what about those health disparities? This is an opportunity for us to really have open conversations about that, to really develop bridges between the healthcare communities and our African American communities. Like I said, over the course of the last few months, I've had more conversations with Black doctors than I've had in my life. And so I think that this shouldn't be for this moment, but it should be continued, that we bring in doctors that look like us to talk about how we can kind of work to eliminate some of those underlying conditions. What can we do in order to keep from having diabetes? What can we do to eat more healthy? What can we do to exercise? What can we do around food deserts and making good food more accessible to us? All those are the issues that COVID just really underscored. And this is an opportunity and a time for us to really address them, particularly as the American Rescue Plans monies roll out state by state and in our cities.
Now, nationally, we have made some progress, substantial progress, in getting people vaccinated, and the pandemic does seem to be subsiding. My wife would say, knock on wood.
Onward.
So, but what's happening with your task force? Are you finding out that you're achieving what you've been trying to achieve? Have you felt that through your efforts and the efforts of others, that there's been an acceleration in the numbers or percentages of African Americans in New York City who have been getting vaccinated?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, the numbers are definitely slowing down in terms of people who are getting vaccinated on a day-to-day basis. But I do believe that's because the work has begun. I mean, there was a backlog of people who were interested in taking the vaccine. And you talked about you and your wife trying to get appointments. I was trying to get appointments for my family, both here and in Texas. Members of my staff were trying to get appointments for senior staff members, and we were luckily able to develop this really terrific partnership with a local hospital, such that literally they were calling and saying, Arva, we've got 2, we've got 3. Can you get somebody here by 6 p.m., right? And that became, that was in the very, very beginning where we had so few doses. And so over time it expanded. And so we were able to say, here's our list for today, or here's our list for this week. and see if you can get those folks appointments. So we feel good about that. It's the same efforts that places like the NAACP did. It's same things that the National Commission for Black Leadership on Health with C. Virginia Fields, that was the type of efforts that she did. So we feel good about that, but there is so much more work to be done. As I mentioned, the National Urban League is launching this All In campaign, which talked to some of the messages about why it's important to consider taking the vaccine. So it gives more information on how the vaccine came to get to market so quickly, and it kind of gives more information on that. There's pictures of individuals, grandma kissing her grandson. There's a picture from, there's all these things that we've missed, and we had the opportunity to go back to it if we're able to take the vaccine. So those are all the pictures and the messages that kind of go into this. And then, just really common sense information as well. This is the place that you go. This is when Jacob Javits is open. This is when you can go to HHS in order to just get that appointment. So those are all the elements of the campaign.
Well, I think we're probably going to have to leave it there because we've run out of time, but I think that the work the task force has been doing has been really terrific and extremely important. So we've been speaking with Arva Rice, and Ms. Rice, thank you so much for doing this with us.
Appreciate the conversation.
Okay, to our viewers, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.